The idea of a man building a giant boat to rescue humanity has been the subject of much interest, scrutiny, and ridicule throughout human history. And Noah and his ark have been a common target for those who wish to dismiss the Bible, often turning it from a historical account into a fable, perhaps with an element of moral teaching. And of all the arguments Bible believers have ever dealt with against accepting the Genesis account of Noah's ark and the great flood as plainly written, the most commonly heard are those that somehow incorporate the topic of dinosaurs. For example, is there even a biblical case for arguing dinosaurs went on Noah's ark? How could dinosaurs have been on board if they died out 65 million years before Noah's flood? If they existed at the same time, why have no human and dinosaur fossils been found together? How could dinosaurs have survived when the flood was over? And where did the dinosaurs go after leaving Noah's ark? All of these questions and more will be answered. The account of Noah and the ark is one of the most widely known events in the history of mankind. Unfortunately, like other Bible accounts, in this day and age, it's often taken metaphorically at best and as a mere fairy tale at worst. And one of the most confusing topics, even for Bible-believing Christians, is how the idea of creatures like dinosaurs could possibly fit with the Noahic account. Of course, for Bible-believing Christians, the Bible is the true history book of the universe. And even the Lord Jesus spoke of the Genesis account of Noah's flood as a real historical event in Matthew 24:37-39, when he said, "For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man." And the writer of the book of Hebrews also spoke of the flood as real history. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. And yet, even many professing Christians today struggle with the idea of dinosaurs being compatible with the plain reading of the flood account. For example, while many, not all, will concede that all of the other various air-breathing animal kinds could have fit on the ark, some think, but surely that couldn't have included those enormous dinosaurs. Or even if they're willing to believe in the historicity of the global deluge approximately 4,500 years ago, they say dinosaurs wouldn't have been part of the payload because science says they went extinct 65 million years earlier. Drilling down deeper, we hear Bible skeptics asking how the dinosaurs could have been kept from wreaking havoc on board the ark, as depicted in movies like Jurassic Park. Or ask questions such as, if humans and dinosaurs were coexisting at the time of the flood, why haven't we found their remains fossilized together? And if dinosaurs did get off the ark afterwards, shouldn't there be recorded descriptions of humans interacting with them, including within the biblical account? And furthermore, what happened to the dinosaurs? Why did they go extinct if they were around just a few thousand years ago after the flood? So we'll be working our way through these and many other related topics over the next episodes. But to begin, let's answer the most obvious question someone could pose right off the bat before we get into the weeds, so to speak. Is there a biblical case for believing dinosaurs were on the ark? Because if not, many might say, why bother going into the weeds in the first place if you don't have to? As mentioned, even many Christians might ask why anyone would even argue that dinosaurs must have been on Noah's Ark. And the answer is simply because it's a logical deduction from the plain reading of the biblical text. Let's work it through. Firstly, the Bible clearly states that God created everything from nothing over 6 days. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Exodus 20, verse 11. Now, it's obvious that there's no time allowed prior to these 6 days because the first verse of the Bible says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," and there's logically nothing prior to "in the beginning." It's also quite obvious that there's no time gap that can be inserted in between or stretched out over those days of creation either. In context, the Hebrew word day in Genesis 1, yom, refers to 6 24-hour days. Every time it appears elsewhere in the Old Testament with the words evening and morning, or with a number like second day, sixth day, etc., it always refers to a 24-hour day. So there's no precedent in the Bible for believing God was saying anything other than what the text clearly indicates. Exodus 20:11 even goes on to say, "Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy," in reference as to how God created over 6 days and rested on the seventh, which is the pattern showing how people are also supposed to work for 6 real days and have a day of rest as well. It's also evident that the Bible is clear that absolutely everything was created by God, and that of course would have included the dinosaurs. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. John 1, verse 3. Now, the detailed history revealed in the creation account tells us that all the land-dwelling creatures were made on day 6 of creation week, the same day God created Adam and Eve. Therefore, without influence from sources outside of Scripture, it's clear that dinosaurs, being exclusively land animals, were made along with man. Also, Genesis 6-9 clearly states that 2 of every kind of land animal, 7 of some, boarded the ark and disembarked after the flood. And as nothing indicates that any of the land animal kinds were already extinct before the flood, it's therefore logical to conclude dinosaurs were part of the cargo carried on board. Now, if we were to see what Hebrew experts might believe about the subject, understand the following quote is from James Barr, the former Oriel Professor of the Interpretation of Holy Scripture from Oxford University in England, now deceased. Note that Barr was a non-Christian and consistent with his neo-Orthodox views. He didn't believe Genesis was real history. He just applied his lifelong expertise and understood what the Hebrew clearly teaches, and what 99% of every Bible version, excluding certain study notes, plainly says. Probably, so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writers of Genesis 1-11 intended to convey to their readers the ideas that creation took place in a series of 6 days, which were the same as the days of 24 hours we now experience. The figures contained in the Genesis genealogies provided by simple addition a chronology from the beginning of the world up to later stages in the biblical story. Noah's flood was understood to be worldwide and extinguish all human and animal life except for those in the ark. So, despite many modern theologians' attempts to overturn what the vast majority of the Church Fathers, the Reformers, and the average lay Christian has understood Genesis 1-11 to clearly mean for hundreds of years, for those who understand what the original Hebrew plainly says, it's quite clear. Now, instead of dealing with the logical implications and the questions that naturally arise from those conclusions, which we'll be dealing with, many Christians have adopted the tactic of attempting to sidestep them rather than face them head on. These most often include simply accepting the evolutionary timeline, involving supposedly millions of years of Earth history, and declaring dinosaurs died out well before the flood, and so wouldn't have been part of the package Noah and his family prepared, therefore doing away with the need for any kind of apologetic and intellectual defense of the faith whatsoever. However, as well-meaning as these attempts might seem on the surface, they come at a tremendous theological cost that is quite destructive to the entire biblical narrative, including the gospel, when brought to their logical conclusions. How so? Firstly, we know about dinosaurs because of their fossils, which are found alongside billions of other creatures in sedimentary layers all over the earth, which is, of course, a record of death. The Bible clearly states that the wages of sin is death in Romans 6:23, and that sin and death, both physical and spiritual, were infused into creation at a specific point in time because of Adam's rebellion against God. We read this not only in the Genesis account, but also in the New Testament as well. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. Romans 5, verse 12. God states that the world he created was very good upon its completion on day 6. And so there couldn't have been death and suffering such as we see in the fossil record having occurred prior during the 6 days of creation. And the fall of man didn't only affect people, as both humans and nature groaned together as they longed to be set free from the consequences of sin, as Romans 8, verse 22 states. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. As a matter of fact, we even see diseases like cancer found in the fossil record, including within dinosaur fossils. So those fossils cannot have been created prior to God's declaration that everything was very good, because obviously cancer is not very good. And Adam's fall and the subsequent fall of the entire creation occurred after the day of rest. So in short, there was no death or corruption part of creation before sin entered when Adam fell. Genesis 1:29 and 30 further clarifies that in the beginning, both the beasts and man were eating plants, which are not technically alive in the same sense as man and animals, for sustenance. And yet, the fossil record contains evidence of creatures consuming one another, which is more clear evidence that those carnivorous events, inferred by what fossils clearly demonstrate, were recorded and captured in the rocks after sin and death entered into the creation because of Adam's fall. And that's why Bible-believing Christians throughout the first 1800 years of the church almost universally held to the idea that the vast majority of the fossil record was created at the time of Noah's flood, which occurred approximately 1650 years after Adam had fallen and sin and death had entered into the creation. It also makes sense of the totality of the eschatological profile the Bible reveals. The Bible clearly states that God will someday fully restore this world to a very good state. And what will that be like? He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth. For the Lord has spoken. Isaiah 25, verse 8. And death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. Revelation 21, verse 4. The Bible is clear that death will eventually be done away with, because it was an intrusion into God's very good world. It's not natural, as many people believe. It had a specific entry point into the creation and will be dealt and done away with at a specific time as well. As 1 Corinthians 15:26 says, "The last enemy to be destroyed is death." In summary, the Bible clearly teaches that God created everything in a very good world with no death, disease, or carnivorous activity in 6 literal days. Sin and death became part of the world when the first man Adam rebelled against God and was punished for his transgression at the time of the fall. There was no death before Adam sinned. So this is why the biblically deduced logical conclusion that dinosaurs were included on board Noah's Ark is an issue that needs to be defended by Bible-believing Christians, who want to uphold the authority of the Scripture as 1 Peter 3:15 commands us to do, to always give a defense for the hope that we have, which is, of course, salvation through Jesus Christ. Defending the topic of dinosaurs being on Noah's Ark is an issue of biblical authority. It means we can simply take the Bible as plainly written. It means we don't have to compromise and be inconsistent by telling people they don't have to believe what the Bible plainly says in one area, the creation account, for example, while insisting we must take it as plainly written elsewhere, such as the need to accept Christ as their Savior. However, instead of sidestepping, that means we should also be able to give a good answer to the other questions we discussed earlier on. Most depictions of Noah's Ark show animals they readily recognize, such as lions, elephants, and monkeys, giraffes, etc. And in most people's mind, these are considered modern kinds of animals, whereas we often hear the term prehistoric assigned to creatures like dinosaurs. They have a hard time believing that dinosaurs lived alongside the other animals that would have been on board Noah's Ark. So, in this episode, we'll demonstrate how the fossil record shows that the idea that dinosaurs and other creatures we'd assume were on Noah's Ark living at the same time isn't hard to believe at all. For many today, the mental image of a supposed land before time or age of dinosaurs, when dinosaurs ruled the earth with no modern animals or humans around, has been so drilled into people's heads, it's hardly ever questioned. And when asked why specifically they believe this is true, a typical answer would have to do with fossils. For example, because of what has been commonly taught regarding the fossil record, most people think that the remains of dinosaurian creatures always appear in the older or deeper parts of the fossil record, while more recently evolved mammalian types appear in younger rocks. This was the scenario almost always illustrated in the dinosaur books I read when growing up, with supposed millions of years of time separating the various animal groups shown on charts within them. And because of it, many, like myself back then, believed that mammals and dinosaurs never coexisted, or if they did, it was only for a short overlapping period when small shrew-like mammals were first evolving. As famous atheist Richard Dawkins put it, all the fossils that we have ever found have always been found in the appropriate place in the time sequence. There are no fossils in the wrong place. So this neat and tidy idea that the fossil lineage contains nothing out of place is strong evidence for evolution in many people's minds. But is this really a valid argument? Well, no. The facts show otherwise. For example, Dr. Carl Werner's 2012 book Living Fossils pointed out that over 432 mammal species had already been identified in dinosaur-era rock, including nearly 100 complete mammal skeletons. By the way, understand that when I refer to dinosaur-era rock, I'm simply referring to what those who hold to the story of evolution believe, that these rock layers are at least 65 million years or older. Which means if these mammals are found in similar layers, they also have to concede these mammals lived alongside them as well. He also points out that despite this, in his travels to over 60 museums around the world, he'd curiously only seen a few dozen of these featured in museum displays, and not one displaying a complete skeleton. However, as the evidence continues to pile up, even popular level science articles have begun showing the often disharmonious, according to evolution, nature of the fossil record. For example, most people have heard that dinosaurs eventually evolved into birds, leading most people to believe that modern bird types and dinosaurs never coexisted. However, a BBC article titled "Cretaceous Duck Ruffles Feathers" featured a picture of a duck-billed type dinosaur on a beach with two birds that looked like modern geese and had a subtitle that said, "Ducks may have been paddling about in primeval swamps when T-Rex was king of the dinosaurs. Scientists have announced in the journal Nature." Now, let's face it, when's the last time you saw a depiction of dinosaurs stomping around as a bunch of geese or ducks flew by quacking overhead? It would seem extremely strange to most people, because we've been conditioned to view dinosaurs as living quite separately from modern animal kinds. And this reinforces the whole land before time paradigm in people's minds. But what's now been found in the fossil record would make our age of dinosaurs mental portrait seem even stranger to most if they were to put it all together in one picture for them. For example, what if you turned on your TV to watch an evolutionary program that showed dinosaurs wandering around in a pine forest, along with bees buzzing, squirrels running around, with frogs, turtles, platypus, and beavers swimming around in a nearby pond, while a badger hunted and then ate a baby dinosaur, a Psittacosaurus, for lunch, for example? Does the idea that mammals ate dinosaurs and that beavers and T-Rexes hung out together in pine forests fit with how you've seen the age of dinosaurs depicted? For most, based on how dinosaurs have been marketed, the answer would be a resounding no. Most people I've talked to are surprised to hear that scientists have reported all of these mammals having been found in rock layers they perceive as being dinosaur era, wondering why they've never heard it before. Here is an explanation from a modern evolutionist from Dr. Werner's book mentioned previously. We find mammals in almost all of our dinosaur dig sites. These were not noticed years ago. We have about 20,000 pounds of bentonite clay that has mammal fossils that we're trying to give away to some researcher. It's not that they're not important, it's just that you only live once, and I specialized in something other than mammals. I specialize in reptiles and dinosaurs. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? It makes you wonder how many other fossil mammals in supposed dinosaur-era rock are still ignored, not noticed, or considered less important than their dinosaur counterparts. The fact is, if these simply weren't noticed years ago, then there's a great likelihood of finding even more representatives of the same kinds as modern-day animals in the fossil layers all around the world, on top of the astounding amount we already have. As one evolutionist, Dr. John Weibel, former mammal curator at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, admitted after finding the remains of what he considered a supposed 53-million-year-old rabbit, "I would not be surprised if I went out into the field tomorrow and found a Cretaceous rabbit that was 80 million years old." You see, while the average person believes in an age of dinosaurs, modern evolutionary paleontologists have admitted the following. In a sense, the age of dinosaurs is a misnomer. Mammals are just one such important group that lived with the dinosaurs, coexisted with the dinosaurs, and survived the dinosaurs. Now, amusingly, I once had an evolutionist write to me to complain that I was misrepresenting what had been reported. His argument was that when I referenced a beaver, for example, that it wasn't a true modern beaver. He also complained that what I'd simply called a badger was actually classified as a Repenomamus robustus, which is true. That was its assigned Latin name. And as he believed the evolutionary explanation that all of these extinct orders are said to have died out tens of millions of years ago with no modern representatives, he declared it was dishonest to say that it has been proven that dinosaurs walked alongside modern type mammals and birds. However, when I asked him if he'd be contacting National Geographic, ABC News, Nature journals, the BBC, Science Magazine, etc., to inform them that they were wrong for using titles like Jurassic Beaver swims into view, fossils suggest platypus lived in dinosaur times, or Cretaceous duck ruffles feathers, he never got back to me. You see, I'm a big believer in what's known as farmer logic. It's the type of common sense that declares if something looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and acts like a duck, it's probably a duck. But evolutionary storytelling sometimes betrays that type of obvious conclusion. Case in point, when a supposedly 110 million year old creature called Gans's was found years ago, one of the reporters commenting on it in a New York Times article titled "Duck Lookalike Reveals Bird's Evolution" said, "It looked like a duck, it swam like a duck. It's not known if it quacked like a duck, but it definitely was not a duck." Now, even though the article said it looked remarkably like a small modern-day waterfowl, why wasn't it considered a duck? Well, likely it was largely because it didn't fit the evolutionary timeline. The reasoning was, ducks supposedly didn't live back then, so even though it looked and apparently swam like a duck, it couldn't possibly be one. However, according to the Ducks Unlimited website, there are over 167 species of ducks, geese, and swans on Earth, so why not simply accept it was just a kind of duck? You see, as most people aren't involved in formal scientific study, one factor in helping dinosaurs seem exclusive to other animals is their names. When people hear terms like Tyrannosaurus rex or Triceratops or Brachiosaurus, the names often sound strangely removed from our common way of speaking about animals like squirrels, bears, and bats, for example. However, if I use the terms Anatidae, Anseriformes, or Chordata, that might spark the same reaction from the average person. But Anatidae is simply the Latin scientific designation for the biological family of water birds that includes ducks, geese, and swans. Anseriformes refers to their order, and Chordata to their designated scientific phylum in our classification system for waterfowl. Conversely, if we refer to dinosaurs in a simpler vernacular, such as sharp-tooth, long neck, and spike nose, they begin to have a more common-sounding feel. And if you were then to say, according to the fossil record, ducks, longnecks, beavers, sharp-toothed, badgers, and spike noses all live together at the same time, it helps normalize the fact that according to the fossil record, these creatures simply all live together at the same time. And that moves the mental image away from that age of dinosaur scenario so commonly depicted. The takeaway point is this: the more we dig, the more we find that billions of dead things were living and then got buried together simultaneously over a very short time, not millions of years ago. There's more and more evidence constantly being found that's completely consistent with what we know from the Bible. Namely, that there was a gigantic catastrophe in the form of a watery deluge, Noah's flood, that destroyed and likely buried representatives of many of the kinds of creatures that were living together, dinosaurs among them, all at the same time. And this then leads us to the topic which many people believe is a real deal breaker for belief in a literal Genesis and Noah's flood and the ark. As mentioned, we showed that the popular idea that the fossil record supports the evolutionary-based idea that dinosaurs never existed alongside the other animals commonly associated being on board Noah's Ark simply doesn't line up with many modern fossil finds. The fact is, fossils of ducks, beavers, badgers, platypus, pine trees, squirrels, and many other common creatures have been found in rock layers evolution-believing scientists consider to be dinosaur age, all of which was unheard of when I was growing up, because it means they all lived at the same time. However, as helpful as this is in favor of believing dinosaurs were in fact on board Noah's Ark, it also spurs on one of the most common questions against the Genesis account of Noah's Ark, which is, if humans and dinosaurs coexisted, why have no human and dinosaur fossils been found together? To answer that, let's pose a similar question that will help frame what the actual issues involved in the question really are. Why don't we find whales and coelacanth fossils buried together? Has any Bible skeptic ever asked that? Certainly no one that I've known. And it's likely the average person has no idea what a coelacanth is. However, I've certainly had many people ask me the why no human and dinosaur bones found together question over the years. So why is that? Well, as explained previously, biblical creationists believe that the Great Flood recorded in Genesis 6-9 is the cause of the majority of the sedimentary rock layers containing billions of fossilized remains found worldwide. And we also believe that dinosaurs, which were air-breathing land animals, were part of the biological payload sent aboard Noah's Ark. So the obvious conclusion is that both humans and dinosaurs coexisted before and after the flood. So what the human with dinosaur fossils question is getting at is this simply logical, yet somewhat naive, assumption that if two different creatures lived together at the same time and coexisted in similar environments, then we should surely find their fossils buried together. However, this isn't as much of an argument as it sounds once you dig into the details involved. In fact, it's actually quite a powerful argument against the story of evolution when you factor in evolution's required millions of years time frame and unpack it fully. For the sake of argument, let's use the two creatures I mentioned earlier, whales and coelacanths, already living in an aquatic environment where evolutionary stories primarily depict fossilization happening, versus dinosaurs and humans, which are both specifically land-dwelling creatures. Now, let's look at these first two candidates in relation to the evolutionary timeline. Coelacanths, living fish once presumed extinct and formerly used as index fossils for the Cretaceous period, are said to date back as far as 410 million years ago. Now, I specifically chose this for our comparison because it's so well known in the creation-evolution debate that it's casually referred to as the dinosaur fish by some. Now, whales are said to have evolved about 50 million years ago. So that means that whales and coelacanths have supposedly coexisted for approximately 50 million years in the same general aquatic environment. However, even though they live together now, and presumably did so throughout this supposed 50 million year old evolutionary timeline, no fossils with whales and coelacanths together have ever been found. So why would that be? Now, before we proceed, let's deal with an objection that can be raised here. Because some might say that although both these creatures live in the same wide-ranging environment, i.e. the ocean, both don't live in the same habitats, so the argument isn't valid. However, although today we observe coelacanths living deeper in the oceans, between 90 to 700 meters deep, and most whales spending more time near the surface, there's actually a tremendous variety of behavior among the 40 different whale types living today, whose activities regularly cause them to traverse all but the most extreme depths of the oceans. Some whales have been documented using satellite-linked tags, diving over 2,900 meters, and some can stay submerged for over 3 hours, which means they regularly pass through coelacanth territory and overlap their habitats constantly. Today, coelacanths are found near the Comoros Islands in the Western Indian Ocean, and some also live along the East African coast into Indonesian waters. Accordingly, a wide variety of whales also frequent these locations, so there's no known reason to believe these creatures ever had any significant separation over time. But still no fossils of them together. Now, skeptics might try to say that all of what we've discussed doesn't provide sufficient opportunity to expect fossils of them to have been found together, as whales generally stayed closer to the surface and coelacanths mostly lived in deeper waters over the last 50 million years, even though there's no way to definitively verify that. But how then would they explain, in probabilistic terms, how the remains of a coelacanth has been found jumbled up with several pterosaur fossils, which are a group of flying extinct reptiles, as reported in a 2021 Live Science article. It stated, "The fossilized lung was part of a large slab uncovered in phosphate beds in Ouedzem in Morocco, which contains several other bones belonging to pterosaurs." Now, even though pterosaurs are thought to have hunted over top water, what are the chances of a land-dwelling flying reptile and deep-sea living coelacanth being buried together versus the remains of a coelacanth and a whale being so? Well, the evolutionary researchers who found them cautiously postulated that because they'd only found the lung of a coelacanth mixed with some pterodactyls, there might have been a rather intriguing chain of events that resulted in this fantastic fish and flyer find. They proposed that perhaps a completely different creature, such as a giant mosasaur or plesiosaur, ate the rather massive, estimated 7 feet long, coelacanth, then, after traveling quite a distance, threw up the coelacanth's lung. Now, their reasoning on this was that because plesiosaurs and mosasaurs are thought to have been modern-day marine reptiles, and because some modern-day lizards sometimes regurgitate their food, typically when stressed or ill, perhaps these creatures did that too. And then, we must presume that a group of pterodactyls swooped in and got that juicy lung, but then were suddenly, somehow, all killed in a sudden fossilization event that entombed them all at once. And of course, all of this happened before the lung, ripped from its owner and then swallowed, surrounded by digestive juices and then later spit up, had fallen apart. Respectively, if you can't hear the special pleading in this tall tale, so typical of evolutionary propaganda, perhaps you should reevaluate what you think science is. Because this isn't science. It's simply another just-so situation commonly heard from those who believe in the story of evolution. It makes far more sense to believe the Genesis account that would explain all sorts of creatures from a wide variety of habitats being buried together rapidly. Now, let's remember that our original comparison is that of the chances of 2 land-dwelling creatures being buried together versus 2 aquatic creatures being so. We know from the fossil record, regardless of which history and mechanisms of fossilization you accept, that marine creatures and plants make up the overwhelming majority of the fossil record. When looking at it, we find 95% of all fossils were shallow marine organisms. 95% of the remaining 5% were algae, plants, trees, and other invertebrates, including insects. The remaining 0.25% were vertebrates, mostly fish. So the observable facts show that from a historical perspective, statistically, there's been a far greater probability of marine animals being fossilized than land creatures by orders of magnitude. Again, given the supposed 50 million years whales and coelacanths were supposed to have coexisted, and how much opportunity they'd have had for interaction and overlap in each other's habitats, and the fact that many dead marine animals, unless scavenged completely beforehand, fall to the bottom of whatever particular area of the ocean they were in, it is very reasonable to imagine many occasions for whale and coelacanths fossilization events to have happened in the imagined evolutionary timeline. Far more reasonable than the flight of fancy just described with the pterosaurs. Theoretically, there would have been billions of each creature, whale and coelacanth, produced during that supposed vast amount of time. And yet, as mentioned, to date, we've never found any fossils of them together. However, none of this definitively proves that these creatures didn't coexist. It obviously just means there simply never happened to be a situation in which the 2 creatures were preserved together. Of course, the same statement can be logically applied to dinosaur and human remains as well. And in fact, to an exponentially higher level of probability when you think through the 2 different historical accounts being held forth. How so? Well, contrast the imagined 50 million year old evolutionary scenario with the historical biblical account. According to the Bible, The flood happened approximately 1650 years after creation. So that would determine the maximum population potential with natural population control mechanisms recognized for any creature being fossilized at the time of the flood. And certainly, there would have been many dinosaurs and people produced during that time. But nowhere near the incredible number of whales and coelacanths that would have been during the supposed 50 million years of evolutionary history. We're talking about 602,250 days of potential procreation versus 18,250,000,000 days. However, don't misrepresent the argument. It's not simply about the total cumulative numbers of potential creatures that could theoretically have existed throughout the two comparative histories, but rather the enormous difference in the amount of time for potential fossilization to occur that's truly staggering. You see, the pool of potential candidates for the fossilization of any creatures together in the biblical timeline is limited primarily to the number of each immediately alive at the time of the flood event. However, the pool of creatures available for fossilization together in the evolutionary history is virtually every coexisting animal ever produced for the entire period of their coexistence. Now, the Bible records that the entire flood event itself was only a year long, with the majority of sedimentation events occurring during the early phase of the flood. But even granting a full year for fossilization to occur, when comparing the probability of a human and a dinosaur skeleton just happening to be deposited together during a mere 365 days versus the chances of a whale and a coelacanth being fossilized together over 50 million years, the difference is enormous. Not to belabor the exact theoretical circumstances under which any of these creatures might have died together, but in a pure time comparison, we're not talking even close to a 1 in a million shot here. We're talking about the difference between 365 days to produce a human with dinosaur fossils versus 18,250,000,000 days of potential permineralization of a coelacanth and a cetacean together. Literally 50 million to 1. And understand, this isn't the only case in which we could do the math and use it to make the point. A few more examples would be living trees such as the ginkgo and woolly pine, supposedly alive at least 240 and 150 million years ago, respectively, that would also have coexisted with dinosaurs for some 95 million years. And they would also have lived with humans for the past 2 million years. Yet, they've also never been found in rock layers with humans or dinosaurs. So once you apply the whole, well, if they aren't found together in the same rocks, they must not have lived at the same time argument to the entire fossil record, no informed evolutionist would hold to it. It's strategic that the particular why no human and dinosaur fossils question is asked rather than almost any other creature comparison. In conclusion, just because certain organisms aren't buried together, it's not a hands-down argument they didn't live together. However, if Bible skeptics insist biblical history is suspect because we specifically haven't found dinosaur and human fossils together yet, how much less viable is the evolutionary story in comparison? By having to add millions of years to the equation, they've compounded by 1,000-fold their difficulty in explaining the very same issue should any two specific creatures or organisms that supposedly coexisted not be found together in the fossil record. And this leads us to another topic we'll be covering, which comes from the logical conclusion that dinosaurs were on the Ark, alongside Noah's family and all of the other animal kinds. A common trope you'll often see when discussing dinosaurs on board the Ark is some type of allusion to them running around terrorizing Noah's family and all of the other animals on board, a la the popular Jurassic Park or Jurassic World movie series. But let's face it, these movies were created to produce a dramatic thrill ride experience, and so purposefully portrayed these animals as huge, terrifying killing machines, despite many suspected scientific inaccuracies. For example, the velociraptors were not based on real velociraptor fossils, which are about the size of a turkey, but rather on what's called a Deinonychus, which was about the size of a human. And newer research points away from the idea that velociraptors were coordinated pack hunters, as they were distinctly portrayed, which pretty well shoots holes in the entire plot lines of many of the Jurassic Park or Jurassic World movies. And although T-Rex was once estimated to be able to run up to 45 miles per hour and was shown sprinting after a Jeep in the first movie, a recent study estimating energy requirements for bipedal dinosaurs at top running speeds has downgraded them under half of that to a maximum speed of 20 miles per hour. Over the years, I've seen T-Rex described in a wide variety of scientific studies as supposedly having starkly different behavior from paper to paper. One would describe them as slow-moving solitary scavengers, and then another as pack-hunting apex predators. Some would depict them as caring moms and dads, and then others as heartless cannibals in the next. The fact is, we don't know for sure, but basing your opinion about the Bible based on CGI-generated dinosaurs in Hollywood movies is hardly thinking it through carefully. And there's good reasons to disregard the notion that the inclusion of dinosaurs would have made Noah's transport more like Jurassic Ark than the life-preserving craft it was designed to be. But regardless of behavior, the sheer size of some of these creatures we found in the fossil record makes the idea of dinosaurs on Noah's Ark seem to be a stretch, until you consider the purpose for all of the animals to be there. God sent the animals he chose to be on board to Noah, and their purpose was to survive and reproduce after the flood was over. So obviously, God wouldn't have sent Grandma and Grandpa dinosaurs on board. He would have sent the young teenagers, so to speak, more juvenile aged and sized creatures that would be healthy and be able to perform their procreative function easily. And according to recent models of dinosaur maturation, even the largest sauropod dinosaurs were no more than several hundred kilograms in weight by the time they were just over a year old, which could have corresponded to their time of release from the Ark. According to the Bible, Noah's Ark was a safe haven for representatives of all the kinds of air-breathing land animals and birds that God sent. And while it's certainly possible that God made miraculous provisions for the daily care of these animals, it's not necessary to appeal to miracles to explain their housing or care. Despite critics commonly speculating the need for millions of animals on board Noah's Ark, the Bible designates the animal cargo was limited only to land-dwelling, air-breathing vertebrate animals, corresponding to modern birds, mammals, and reptiles, as well as their extinct counterparts. So, not every species or current variety of animal was needed on the Ark. Chapters such as Leviticus 11 demonstrate that the created kind, the word min in Hebrew, was a much broader category than our modern term of classification of species. As National Geographic stated in an article about domestic dogs, the term domestic dog refers to any of several hundred breeds of dogs in the world today. While these animals vary drastically in appearance, every dog, from the Chihuahua to the Great Dane, is a member of the same species, Canis familiaris. However, all modern dog breeds can be traced back to wolves, which means wolves were likely much closer to the originally created dog kind that God would have sent to Noah. And all current variations of what we call canines, such as foxes, dingoes, coyotes, etc., have descended from that original pair that left the Ark after the flood and spread out around the world. Just like if you were to examine the bones of a Great Dane compared to a wolf, compared to a Chihuahua skeleton, versus that of a bulldog's remains side by side a fox, you'd notice a large range of features and differences in their anatomy, and yet they're all the same kind of creature, the dog kind. Similarly, although scientists often declare that they've found a new dinosaur type, most often all they've found is some variation of the approximately 80 different kinds that we've already found. Ceratopsians, for example, they come in all different shapes and sizes, but the basic body plan is the same. They walked on all fours, had a beak-like mouth, a frill, and a wide assortment of horns, and yet they were all the same kind of dinosaur. Current baromenological research, the study of the created kinds, suggests that the created kind most closely corresponds to the family level in current taxonomy. Recent studies estimate the total number of living and extinct kinds of land animals and flying creatures to be about 1,500. So even with a worst-case scenario approach to calculating the total number of animals needed on the Ark, this would mean that Noah cared for approximately 7,000 animals in total, and that would include the dinosaurs. According to the Bible, the Ark had 3 decks or floors. It's not difficult to show that there was plenty of room for 7,000 animals, assuming they required approximately the same floor space as animals in typical farm enclosures and laboratories today. Remember, the vast majority of the creatures, birds, reptiles, and mammals, were quite small. The largest animals like elephants, sauropods, rhinos, and tyrannosaurs were probably only a few hundred pounds of body weight apiece, because, as discussed, even the largest dinosaurs were relatively small when only a few years old. Anti-Bible critics have compared the challenges of caring for the animals on Noah's Ark with that of modern zoos. But this isn't an apples-to-apples comparison whatsoever. There's a big difference between the long-term care needed for animals kept in zoos and the temporary emergency care required on the Ark. This was an extreme one-time struggle for existence event, so animals' cozy comfort and appearance weren't essential, because survival was the primary goal. The common assumption that what we'd term carnivorous dinosaurs and other animals would have had to eat meat while on board the Ark isn't a given. For example, crocodiles and alligators today are thought of as meat-eating predators, and yet, unknown to most people, they commonly eat large amounts of fruit. As a scientific study concluded, while the authors say some of the fruit ingestion may have been incidental to prey capture, evidence shows that other fruit is consumed deliberately and in large quantities. And another NBC article reporting on a study in the Journal of Zoology stated, scientists investigated 18 species of crocodilian, ranging from the American alligator to the fearsome Nile crocodile, and found evidence that 13 of those species devoured fruit of some kind, including a variety of berries, legumes, nuts, and grains. Because early research suggested crocodilians were unable to digest sugars and other plant-based nutrients, scientists previously believed plant materials found in crocodiles or alligators were just incidental, and any fruit was likely just swallowed along with prey. As one researcher said, everyone just rejected the notion that crocodilians eat fruit because everyone supposed they only ate meat. Which just goes to show that what people, even scientists, assume to be true often isn't. And that the common objections heard against believing Noah's Ark is real history, often accompanied by a smirky grin and a dismissive eye roll, should be carefully analyzed before being believed. In fact, there have been many modern examples of animals normally considered to be carnivores that refuse to eat meat, such as a lion known as Little Tyke. She refused to eat meat and was fed solely a diet of various grains, milk, and eggs. Additionally, during times of war or natural disaster when meat was unobtainable, zoos and wildlife parks have utilized various meat substitutes like nuts, peanut butter, coconuts, beans, soy, and other legumes as their protein source feed for the animals. So, Even if carnivory was prevalent in the late pre-flood world, as is demonstrated by the fossil record, it's still possible that animals that God sent didn't eat meat or were omnivores that could have survived for 1 year without meat. After all, Genesis 1:29 and 30 records that all creatures were originally designed to eat plants in the beginning, before the creation was corrupted. Perhaps examples like little tyke are not only a reminder of what the original perfect, very good creation was like, but what it will be again someday. There's no reason to think dinosaurs couldn't have eaten basically the same foods as the other animals. The young representatives of the large sauropods could have eaten compressed hay, other dried plant material, seeds and grains, and the like. And carnivorous dinosaurs could have eaten dried or reconstituted meat, or slaughtered animals such as giant tortoises, which would have been ideal to use as food in this regard, as they were large and needed little food to be maintained themselves. In a world of fast food restaurants and superstores, we might think that idea strange. However, seafarers in the 16 and 1700s frequently brought giant tortoises on their ships as a fresh meat source, because tortoises are very hardy and can sometimes stay alive for over a year without food themselves. Another factor that may have reduced food consumption for both vegetarian and carnivorous dinosaurs is that they went into a state of hibernation or brumation or torpor. Many reptiles today begin to eat less, reduce their metabolic rate drastically, and then sleep for long periods of time when the weather gets a little cooler, virtually eating nothing and waking up for only brief periods to drink before re-entering brumation. Often, the best conditions for this state are humidity, lower temperatures, and low light conditions. And the outside weather at the time of the flood, rainy and thus likely cool, combined with the lower light interior compartments of the Ark, would make ideal hibernation, brumation conditions on the Ark. So, if any of the animals went into brumation, then food requirements would have been severely reduced. However, 1. Because of the relatively few kinds of animals, which included dinosaurs, needed on board. 2. The fact that juveniles, which require far less food, would likely be the ideal candidates on board. And 3. The fact that there was more than enough room for a wide variety of food stores on board. Hibernation isn't a requirement for explaining those common objections. However, there are even more questions about the feasibility of Noah's Ark that are often asked, from water and air requirements to how did Noah do away with the dinosaur doo-doo, so to speak. Despite the objections often heard, the facts of the matter are that studies of non-mechanized animal care indicate that it's easily believable that just a few adults could have cared for 7,000 creatures. Modern Bible skeptics often love to scoff at the possibility that a single family could coordinate such a huge undertaking, citing supposed enormous difficulties such as, how could you feed so many animals every day? Where would you put all their waste? And how could you provide and replenish their water? But the answer is simply the old adage, don't work harder, work smarter. And the biggest key in doing that for Noah's family would have been to prepare systems beforehand while building and loading the Ark, so as to avoid walking around unnecessarily once they were underway. And what do I mean by that? Well, simple ideas like spreading out and storing food and water near each animal beforehand, or even better, piping gravity-fed drinking water into troughs, just as the Chinese have used bamboo pipes for this purpose for thousands of years, would make sense. And using some sort of self-feeders, as is commonly done for birds, would have been essential and relatively easy to set up and operate. Skeptics often point to animals that today require special care or diets as impossibilities for Noah's Ark being possible. But this assumes that these animals were likewise specialized at the time of the flood. But that may not have been the case in the ancestral kinds that were taken on the Ark. And as we saw when we discussed plant-eating crocodiles, creatures can often subsist on food uncommon to their normal preferences in many cases. And even if there were some special case food requirement scenarios for a few specific kinds of animals, this wouldn't have been an overwhelming amount of extra work for Noah's family to have dealt with. It would just make sense, with Noah being over 500 years in age, that he would have knowledge to be able to incorporate automatic feeding systems that only had to be refilled occasionally using simple tools like wheelbarrows, pitchforks, and food scoops to do so. Rainwater collected from gutters built into the roof would provide ongoing refills for water cisterns, which would reduce the need for water storage considerably. But the sheer size of the ark eliminates that as a necessity, although it would simply make sense that they would have done so. The most likely solution would have been a combination of storage and rainwater collection. Now, some might wonder how larger creatures like some of the dinosaurs would have dealt with being cooped up without a lot of exercise for that long. However, the dim lighting in the ark would have had a positive impact on many reptiles and amphibians, making them largely inactive. Inactive crocodiles, for instance, are known to last up to 3 years without a meal. And although many larger animals may have needed to get out and stretch occasionally, Noah could have come up with some practical solutions that wouldn't require too much extra space, such as having an open area where larger animals could be channeled via a system of gates, allowing them to exercise on a rotation schedule. In the original Jurassic Park movie, there's a memorable moment where the character of Dr. Ian Malcolm, played by actor Jeff Goldblum, expresses astonishment when he comes upon a large mound of collected dinosaur droppings. And it emphasized the somewhat humorous and obvious conclusion that many Bible critics regularly throw out against the historical account, which is, how could Noah and company possibly have dealt with the ark's leading export, manure, and animal urine? And it's a good question when you think about it, as there would certainly have been a whole bunch of potential problems piling up over their year-long voyage if it couldn't have been handled properly. One of which would have been a possible buildup of methane gas, something that any firefighter will tell you is nothing to take lightly. Skeptics will often tout statistics such as the fact that just one adult elephant defecates about 12 to 15 times and can produce in excess of 100 kilograms or 220 pounds of dung per day. This means over the span of a year, an elephant will produce over 40 tons of dung. They mock the idea of Noah's Ark being turned into a massive floating outhouse when considering the idea of massive sauropods and other huge dinosaurs being on board. Now, firstly, we must remember the likelihood of juvenile or sub-adult representatives of larger animals such as dinosaurs, elephants, rhinos, etc. having been on board, which would of course mean far less solid waste than skeptics like to project. Remember, the end goal of bringing them on board the ark was to keep them alive and to ensure that they would be fruitful and multiply. So, bringing full-size dinosaurs that only had a few years left or were past their reproductive prime seems illogical. When calculating the entirety of the waste produced by the entire group of onboard contributors, this would bring the amount down to perhaps 12 or so tons in total per day, which is still a huge amount of work if it required people for direct disposal or neutralization. But of course, the key to keeping the enclosures largely waste-free was to avoid the need for Noah and his family themselves to do all of the work, and to get the animals and the ark's design to do it for them. In this regard, there could have been slatted floors and animals could have simply trampled their waste and soil bedding into pits below, whose angled floors possibly dropped the waste out into the ocean. Alternatively, sloped floors in other animal enclosures could have allowed the waste to flow into large central gutters, again allowing gravity to do most of the collective work, while Noah's family could have then dumped this overboard without an excessive expenditure of manpower. Small animals such as birds could have multiple levels in their enclosures, and waste could have been simply accumulated at the bottom of each and collected and disposed of periodically. As per the urine, the same principles apply. Noah could have built slatted or grooved floors beneath some of the cages, perhaps with gutters, to help automate the process of waste collection. Bamboo would have again been a practical choice because it resists urine's corrosive effects and so could have been used to pipe away liquid waste. Liquid and solid waste could also have been emptied into a cavity inside the ship that opened into the ocean, called a moon pool. Although the concept has been around a long time, it wasn't used much until recently with the arrival of drill ships designed for oil exploration. But today, it's now even been incorporated into modern ships such as the RRS Sir David Attenborough. To understand how a moon pool operates, picture a ship with a hole in the bottom of the hull and a wall surrounding the hole all the way up through to the top deck. Water won't enter into the ship because it's contained inside the moon pool's walls, moving up and down like a piston as the ship rides the waves. And there are several sound engineering reasons to believe Noah may have included such a feature, as firstly, it would help relieve hull stress as the vessel crested a wave. Second, the rising and falling water within the moon pool could be used to draw in fresh and also extract stale air. And thirdly, recent research has shown that moon pools induce resistance to movement. For Noah's ship, this may have dampened wave motion, making the voyage more comfortable for all aboard. The danger of toxic or explosive manure gases, such as methane, would be alleviated by the constant movement of the ark, which would have allowed manure gases to be constantly released. Methane, which is half the density of air, would quickly find its way out the window at the top of the ark. Now, the Bible's not specific as to the kind and size of the window on the ark. However, it's reasonable to believe that even one relatively small window would have adequately ventilated the entire ark. Of course, if there was a window running around the entire top center section, which the biblical description allows for, all occupants would have been even more comfortable. It's also interesting to note that the convective movement of air, driven by temperature differences between the warm-blooded animals and the cold interior surfaces, would have been significant enough to drive the flow of air. Plus, wind blowing into the window would have enhanced the ventilation further. So there's no reason to believe that the levels of these gases within the ark would have even remotely approached hazardous levels. And while the problem of manure odor may at first thought seem inconceivable to us sanitized and so-called more civilized modern homeowners, we should remember that having barns separate from human living quarters is a relatively recent development. Throughout most of human history, humans lived together with their farm animals regularly. As the average dinosaur is about the size of a bison, and the estimated number of dinosaur kinds, of which only a pair of each was brought, was approximately 80 to 85, it means somewhere around a maximum of 170 dinosaurs were taken on board the ark. Therefore, the ark had adequate space for every kind of dinosaur, particularly if God sent subadults to Noah. For example, the average 24 by 7 foot cattle trailer can safely haul a maximum of 11 1,200-pound cows. If cattle were transported with a common semi-truck trailer measuring 53 feet long and 8.5 feet wide, an average of 28 such animals could be safely hauled. That means, even assuming the maximum number of dinosaur kinds, only 6 of the 450 semi-truck trailer storage capacity for a royal cubit-sized ark would be needed for the dinosaurs. The fact is, when you consider the density of animals on the ark, compared to the volume of enclosed space, it was actually much less than we find in some modern mass animal housing used to keep stock that are raised for food, such as chicken farms, which often require no special mechanical ventilation. So while the voyage of the ark may not have been comfortable or easy, it was certainly doable, even with dinosaurs on board, because God always keeps his word. Noah accomplished everything God had commanded because Noah knew his Creator had made a promise to save both him and his household and deliver them into a completely new environment after the floodwaters had subsided. And that leads to even more questions often asked about Noah's Ark and the Great Flood that we often hear regarding how the creatures would have been able to survive in the devastated environmental landscape they would have walked off the Ark into. Many arguments against the aftermath of the flood account pose supposed problems with food supply. For example, skeptics often say that the meat-eating dinosaurs and other carnivores released from the Ark would have soon eaten up the other limited amount of animals available, leading to the extinction of all of them in short order. But this falsely assumes that 1. The only sources of meat available to the Ark-released carnivores were the other animals that disembarked. 2. There were only the same number of creatures that got off the Ark that went on board, and 3. All the animals were released at the same time. Firstly, although there are no real specifics as to which creatures were released in what order, or exactly how long it took until the very last animals exited, logic dictates that simply opening every pen door and sitting back and watching utter mayhem ensue likely wasn't the way the animals' release would have taken place. And the Bible gives us a definite clue that wasn't the case as well. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth, went out by families from the Ark. Genesis 8, verse 19. That detail given that they went out by families lends credence to the idea that there would have been planning involved as to what animals would be let loose first. And more importantly, that there were offspring produced by some animals during the voyage. And of course, over the course of a year, many animals were also likely pregnant and ready to give birth around the time they left the Ark. And that means it may have taken several weeks or even a month between when the first creature left and the last animal disembarked, Noah's newly grounded zoo. Also, it makes sense that larger animals, like the dinosaurs, may have been placed on the lowest decks so they would have felt less movement, had less risk of falling and injuring themselves, also acting as ballast. And if the creatures were let loose in a general order of those on the highest to the lowest deck, there may have been several weeks head start of certain creatures over others. During this time, these later disembarking creatures would have simply continued to stay in their enclosures and eat the food stores provided to them, the same as they would have been eating over the last year. Meanwhile, those already released out into the post-flood environment would have had to fend for themselves with what was available in this new world. And what would have that been like? Well, considering the billions of creatures we see entombed in the rock layers worldwide because of Noah's flood, imagine the greater number of creatures that would have simply been caught up in the torrent of water, that were not buried and simply drowned. The post-flood world would have had plenty of rotting corpses of various animals that were not buried in flood sediments, and experience has shown that most carnivores prefer to eat carrion than to kill live animals for food. Also, when you picture the waters receding towards the end of the flood, you can imagine that there must have been many residual pools of water containing marine life left behind afterwards. And as these waters retreated or dried up, fish and other marine animals would be left stranded and available for consumption. These alternative food sources would have diverted the attention of predators for a considerable period of time after the flood. And this would have allowed animal populations to build up to an appreciable size before they became the target of predators. Also, as we discussed in the last episode, many creatures that are considered strictly carnivorous today, such as crocodiles and lions, have been shown to not only have the ability to eat plants, but in some cases seek it out. So what about the plants? Critics often ask how creatures could survive without them, imagining Noah and his passengers stepping out onto a mud ball devoid of any plant life whatsoever. Well, according to the biblical timeline, they wouldn't have had to. The flood event took place over the course of just over a year, and the Bible gives exact details as to when certain events occurred within it. It began on the 600th year of Noah's life and lasted 370 days after. 371 if you count the first and last day as full days. And it was 150 days after the flood started that the ark was grounded somewhere on the mountains of Ararat. However, we're not given the exact altitude on which it did so. So from that point on, vegetation could have started to regrow on whatever land was exposed as the waters began to recede. That means plant regrowth immediately around where the ark landed started at least 7 months before the first animals other than the birds were released. To keep this in perspective, although various grass seed germinates at different rates depending on various factors, it typically occurs between 5 and 10 days. Once germinated, grass usually grows at a rate of about 2 to 3 centimeters per week, which means even at a slower rate, after only 6 weeks, it's almost 12 centimeters or almost 5 inches tall. Vegetables like cucumbers, beans, carrots, and corn take around 2 or 3 months to bear fruit, while potatoes may take 3 or 4. Other underground plants such as turnips and radishes can be ready to eat in as little as a month, while veggies like pumpkins, peppers, cauliflower, and eggplants can take up to about 5 months to mature. Trees, of course, take longer, and their growth rates vary widely. However, some fast-growing types, such as the Thuja green giant, is an evergreen that can reach 15 to 20 feet after only 3 years and stands up to 40 feet tall when mature. Such very adaptable, resilient, disease and insect-resistant types were likely what began providing more stabilizing ecosystems immediately after the flood. Now, the first record of plant life returning is, of course, the olive leaf that was brought back by the dove in Genesis 8, verses 10 to 11. This happened at approximately day 278 of the flood event, a full 128 days after the ark came to rest on one of the mountains of Ararat. Olive trees are one of the hardiest of plants that can regenerate from almost any fragment. It's well known that if pieces of olive branches are buried in the soil, they sprout shoots very rapidly and, like many other plants, reproduce by asexual budding. So this was ample time for the olive to be producing new leaves from regenerated pieces. However, not all plants grow from cuttings. Most grow from seeds. So how could seeds have possibly lasted floating around in the ocean for the duration of the flood? Surprising to some, the very father of today's story of evolution, Charles Darwin, and modern scientists such as George F. Howe, a PhD in botany, have performed experiments to determine whether seeds could have survived being soaked in salt water, and how they could be transported over long distances by water. And their conclusions, far from helping debunk the Genesis account, actually provide great insight into how some plants and seeds could have survived during the flood. For example, Howe discovered that even after 140 days of soaking, the seeds of wild-flowering plant types were still viable enough to germinate. Many seeds have an inbuilt mechanism that allows them to become dormant when saturated and then germinate when they dry out. Darwin also made the observation: the carcasses of birds, when floating on the sea, sometimes escape being immediately devoured, and many kinds of seeds in the crops of floating birds long retain their vitality. Some taken out of the crop of a pigeon, which had floated on artificial seawater for 30 days, to my surprise, nearly all germinated. Like Darwin's discoveries, many of the carcasses that died in the flood could have floated as carrion on the surface of the waters, holding and protecting seeds in their bodies. And many plants and seeds could have survived on vegetation mats of floating debris as well. This same floating vegetation may have contained many uprooted trees and other plants that could have survived and then regrown once the flood waters receded. So some seeds could have survived in root systems just as Charles Darwin observed. Out of one small portion of the earth, thus completely enclosed in by the roots of an oak tree about 50 years ago, 3 dicotyledonous plants germinated. Of course, an obvious way that plants would have survived is that they were taken onto the ark as food for Noah, his family, and the animals. And these were replanted by Noah and his family after the flood. After all, we're told Noah specifically planted a vineyard after the flood in Genesis 9:20. As well, after leaving the ark, any of the seeds the animals ingested during their final days on the ark could have passed through them and then been left on the ground in the animal's excrement and germinated soon after. We should also remember there are tree and plant species that actually thrive in flood-like conditions. For example, mangroves, which live primarily along tropical coastlines, along with many flowering plants and trees that flourish in swamplands, such as white cedar, eastern hemlock, black spruce, red maple, elm, pin oak, and birch. Knowing that some trees withstand saturating water conditions makes it difficult to say plants could not have survived the flood, because those trees literally thrive in those conditions. The big picture is that the skeptics claim that plants couldn't have survived the flood and/or there wouldn't have been anything for the animals to eat after the flood is totally unwarranted based on what science has demonstrated. Ironically, by making this claim, they'd have to discount studies done by Darwin and many other evolution-believing scientists. There would have been a bunch of greenery available to creatures as they stepped off the ark, even enough for the dinosaurs that would eventually grow to immense sizes afterwards and spread out all over the earth. Interestingly, the creature called the behemoth described in Job 40 fits the description of one of these creatures quite well. It was massive, fed on grass like an ox, and had a tail like a huge cedar tree. And it was observed by Job after the flood, not before. The fossil record bears tribute to the fact that many dinosaurs perished alongside billions of other creatures during the Genesis flood. But many people ask, where's the evidence that dinosaurs and people survived and coexisted after the deluge? One of the most obvious facts that can be offered is the sheer number of dragon legends that people groups from around the world have. These are so common and obviously problematic that evolutionists cannot easily dismiss them. In fact, no other than the renowned atheistic evolutionist Carl Sagan wrote an entire book titled Dragons of Eden that attempted to explain them away. Sagan recognized the descriptions in dragon legends are remarkably similar to dinosaurs, and he admitted that these similarities were probably no accident, saying, "The pervasiveness of dragon myths in the folk legends of many cultures is probably no accident. It's a worldwide phenomenon." And what was his explanation of why humans worldwide have claimed to have seen huge reptilian beasts in the past? The R complex is functioning in the dreams of humans. The dragons can be heard, hissing and rasping, and the dinosaurs thunder still. Notice Sagan's quote connects dragons to dinosaurs in the same sentence, using the terms interchangeably, intimating that whatever these creatures were, they were the same thing. However, Sagan's R-complex explanation was scientifically absurd, concluding that humans inherited memories of seeing dinosaurs from our far earlier, more primitive ancestors. According to Sagan's theory, these non-human ancestors of ours were so impressed with seeing dinosaurs that the memory of them was somehow imprinted into their DNA and passed on to us. Basically, these inherited memories are where dragon legends came from. Try convincing your local biology professor that the idea of inheriting memories seen by supposed millions of years old creatures is scientifically viable. You're likely to be taken about as seriously as a local fortune teller. To this day, evolutionists still don't have a good answer as to why people groups all over the world claim to have seen creatures resembling dinosaurs throughout history. Even the 1973 World Book Encyclopedia contained this entry under dragons. The dragons of legend are strangely like actual creatures that have lived in the past. They are much like the great reptiles, dinosaurs, which inhabited the earth long before man is supposed to have appeared on earth. For someone wondering why critics tend to mock the idea that references to dragons were in fact what we call dinosaurs today, no one could have explained it better than Bible skeptic Louis Jacobs, the former president of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. In his book, quest for the African dinosaurs, he said, "Such an association would dispel an Earth with vast antiquity. The entire history of creation, including the day of rest, could be accommodated in the 7 biblical days of the Genesis myth. Evolution would be vanquished." Indeed, Jacob's comment is the perfect summation. If humans saw dinosaurs, and they did, evolution is dead in the scummy water it was supposed to have been spawned from. And the plethora of dinosaur depictions demonstrating people did observe these creatures, found on tapestries, carvings, and engravings around the world, prove it. Indeed, just 3 such unique finds depicting sauropods clearly demonstrate humans witnessed live dinosaurs. How so? Well, one of the oldest Mesopotamian cylinder seals, cylinder-shaped seals rolled on clay to embed images. 2, an engraving on Richard Bell's tomb, Bishop of Carlisle buried in Carlisle Cathedral in the UK. And 3, the Narmer Palette, a vase from the First Dynasty Egypt, and estimated to be from 3100 to 2890 BC. These all have creatures that the average child would readily recognize as looking similar to a sauropod, all having long necks and tails, etc. Most fascinatingly, all 3 show them with their long necks entwined. Each of these artifacts are separated in time by hundreds of years, and geographically by hundreds of miles from where each was created, by 3 separate and distinct people groups living at different times in history. And yet all 3 groups depicted these long-necked, long-tailed creatures, unlike any living animals today, in the same pose, as if performing the same activity, like giraffes necking. This is indeed strong evidence that people observed these creatures through time. The fact that these dragon legends are worldwide leads to another question. How did the dinosaurs and all of the other creatures get from the Ark to the far-flung reaches of the Earth after the flood, which would be practically impossible today? Are we really saying that kangaroos on the mountains of Ararat somehow hopped all the way to Australia, or that longnecks somehow strolled down to South Africa? The truth is, there aren't many details in the Bible on how these animals migrated. However, scientific research that's been done point to 2 main mechanisms for animal dispersion after the Ark landed. 1, post-flood environmental conditions, and 2, human behavior. First of all, while it's true that major bodies of water separate continents from one another today, even secular scientists agree that at one time, the oceans were much lower in the past during the height of the Ice Age. This would have required a massive amount of water removed from Earth's oceans through precipitation to provide for it, which would have lowered sea levels dramatically. A simple Google image search with a mix of keywords like extent of the Ice Age, world map, and ocean levels will reveal several depictions of the continents of the world as it is now, with an additional extended outline beyond where those continents are today that depict how far they believe the continents would extend above water due to the lowered sea level at the time of the Ice Age. So, the animals that populated the Earth far away from the mountainous region of Ararat, where Noah's Ark landed some 4,500 years ago, would have eventually been able to travel across land bridges for the most part. Although skeptics often mock the idea of creatures traveling such vast distances, we're talking hundreds of years of time and many generations of creatures, representing millions of offspring doing the trek incrementally, not all at once during a brief sprint. Because even small animals are quite capable of covering incredible distances. For example, when cane toads, not the spryest of God's creatures, were introduced into Australia with an initial population of 102, it only took 10 years for their population to spread a distance of 2,000 kilometers. These pesky toads now populate entire regions of the continent, estimating at over 200 million strong today.
Also, rabbits, not native to the Australian mainland before being introduced in 1859, spread across it completely in far less than one person's lifetime. So, fantastic powers aren't needed to explain animal dispersion, and they often use much less sophisticated methods of travel, like getting stranded on debris after a storm. Floating vegetation mats made of trees and other plants ripped up during the global flood could have also served as rafts to transport animals around the world. Now, regardless of the travel opportunities afforded to the majority of creatures that disembarked from Noah's Great Zoo, skeptics still try to marginalize the account by pointing to creatures like the platypus, for example, a creature they would say is far too small and fragile to have taken the trip of thousands of miles through the merciless deserts between northern Australia and Tasmania in the south. However, even ignoring a more circuitous route on vegetation mats as mentioned, platypus could have easily migrated through Australia when it was lush and green, as there's indisputable evidence that Australia's inland once had a thriving rainforest, which fits well with the history of a once saturated world having dried out after the flood. One criticism is that kangaroos couldn't have hopped to Australia because there's no fossils of kangaroos on the way. But that's predicated on the assumption that fossils inevitably form from animal populations, when in fact, fossilization requires sudden, rapid burial. Otherwise, the bones decompose before permineralization. For example, despite the fact that millions of bison used to roam the prairies of North America, hardly any bison fossils are found there. Similarly, lion fossils are not found in Israel, although we know that they once lived there. For most people, it should be obvious that no individual dog, dinosaur, porcupine, pterodactyl, or platypus would have had to make the entire trip to various locations around the world. Overall, the key to understanding animal migration after the flood is simply the concept of slowly but surely. Each generation simply moved a little distance further than its parents had. Given hundreds of years, connected land masses at that time, and millions of individual offspring, it's more than reasonable to understand how they arrived and why there are dragon legends all over the world. And this, of course, leads us to our last question. Why did dinosaurs go extinct when all of the other animals survived? However, this is based on a misconception. Because of the various animal kinds Noah took on board the ark about 4,500 years ago, not all survived. In fact, most have gone extinct. You see, when calculating the total number of these kinds that went on board the ark, fossil families as well as living families are included, so as to understand which kinds existed at the time of the flood. And among mammals, for example, the families alive today only represent approximately 30% of the mammals that then existed, which means that around 70% of mammal families are now extinct. In other words, 70% of the kinds of mammals that Noah brought on board the ark have since perished, not extinction by virtue of burial in the flood, rather via extinction after the flood. And of course, in the case of dinosaurs, that appears to be 100% at this time, although we know the last of them died out fairly recently, as evidenced by the dragon legends referenced earlier. Creatures continue to go extinct all the time, all over the planet. However, I would venture the average person asked would say the giant asteroid theory as an answer to what caused dinosaur extinction, as it's still the most commonly depicted in popular culture. However, if the dinosaurs, platypus, ducks, squirrels, beavers, etc., that we saw were all living together as evidenced by their fossils, why would an asteroid impact only selectively kill the dinosaurs and not the other creatures, including their supposed evolutionary close cousins, the lizards and the crocodiles? The fact is, not one single event has ever been proposed by evolutionists that can completely explain dinosaur extinction. which is why there are several more extinction theories out there the average person is usually unaware of. Obviously, the various kinds of animals that exited the ark faced serious challenges over the last 4,500 years. With their numbers greatly reduced following the flood, all animals would be subject to several factors making them vulnerable to extinction. Some may have had a unique physiology that made them less able to adapt as rapidly to the many different environments after the flood. For example, evolutionists have suggested that dinosaurs may not have been warm-blooded or cold-blooded, but something completely different from either. Which means they may have had a unique type of metabolism, unlike any living animal today. And for those looking for a unique or specific reason, one could conjecture that perhaps this contributed to them becoming extinct quicker than some of the other animals. But ultimately, they likely perished for the very same general reasons all of the other animals that are extinct today have, such as environmental pressures, genetic load, varying climates, disease, hunting, food shortages, predation, etc. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1, verse 1. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Exodus 20, verse 11. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Hebrews 11, verse 7. As you can see, when you start from the truth of God's Word and then put all of the evidence together, it's actually very easy to answer the common skeptical questions raised against trusting the authority of God's Word regarding Noah's Ark, dinosaurs, and the flood. God made dinosaurs along with the rest of His creation around 6,000 years ago. We find their fossilized bones alongside those of other animals because of Noah's flood around 4,500 years ago. They lived after the flood, but gradually died out, like so many other animal kinds have. And although we couldn't possibly answer every question someone might have, the most important thing to know is that there are answers when you're willing to look for them. Most importantly, we also hope you've come to see there's absolutely no reason not to trust the Word of God from the very first verse.